The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Tonight we're talking about children and sports. As our children get ready for school athletics, are they ready to avoid injuries? Stay tuned. You're watching Health Connections. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm your host, David Larson. High school sports are one of the cornerstones of a teenager's high school experience. Many students participate in a wide range of sports each year. Some student athletes, however, have the unfortunate experience of getting injured. Before we get started, I want to remind you at home to call in with your questions and comments. Has your child had an experience with injuries in high school? Give us a call. The number will be at the bottom of your screen. Our guest tonight is Kris Dutton, a certified athletic trainer. Kris, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Dave.
Great. Well, now tell us a little bit about yourself. You work with the Austin Medical Clinic, is that right?
That's correct. I'm a certified athletic trainer that works down in the orthopedic and rehabilitation services. And then I also do some outreach to the Austin High School.
Oh, great.
We do try to do a little coverage amongst like Lyle, Adams area for some of the sports, like football basically, and we do have some outreach with some of the physicians down there too that help out. So.
And do you also work with Riverland a little bit also with their sports?
Actually, Riverland has another certified athletic trainer.
Okay.
She does most of the coverage. On occasion, I do assist her and help out when they get into a bind and need a little help, so I'll go and help cover some of the events there.
Right. Okay. So you, working with the medical clinic then, you cover injuries, that have come into the medical center. Do you also go out to the games and actually, are you on site, so to speak, at some of the games, or do you wait for injuries to come into the center?
Most of my time is generally spent at the high school. With Austin High School, I do cover, kind of in a general sense, pretty much all of the home activities. So, for instance, in the fall, I cover, there's women's or girls volleyball, boys football, boys and girls soccer, there's girls swimming, and there's also boys and girls cross country. And typically I'm at all of those home events to provide the sports medicine coverage.
Right.
So in case of an injury and that, so I do
quite
a bit.
You get around then.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, wow. Well, let's talk a little bit. I'm kind of curious about the difference between low-impact sports or non-contact sports and kind of heavy contact sports.
Okay.
Are there different kinds of injuries that are produced in the various sports, and what's the variety of what you end up seeing out there?
Okay. I would say, for the most part, any type of sport you're involved with, is definitely an impact related with whether it's running or cutting, jumping, and stuff like that. When it comes down to like the contact, especially in the fall, you're thinking, football. Obviously, the majority of that is running into each other, and definitely gets some more. I guess I like to put it in the way that there's potential for higher risk injuries in the contact sports than versus the non-contact. Now, in the fall here, my non-contacts would be like your cross country, volleyball. Typically is labeled as a contact sport, but there is potential for it to happen.
Sure.
I guess my thought process when I see a contact, non-contact injury, you think of the high velocity speeds and collisions. Or like say, like lacrosse or soccer, there's definitely the body contact. So yes, you do get into some potential more serious injuries, more traumatic type injuries.
Right.
So.
I think probably every parent who has had a student involved in a contact sport worries about concussions.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about that, because that can be a serious injury. How do we assess or diagnose a concussion, and tell us a little bit about what we should know about it to kind of ease our fears about it.
Okay. Well, I'll just start with saying, I mean, any sport you're involved in, there's the potential to sustain a head injury or a concussion. Typically with, I guess the most prevalent one would be football. And I'll use that as my example just for the fact that, again, the high impact injuries. Generally when a person sustains a concussion, there's going to be obviously some form of maybe a disorientation with that person. That can happen even if it isn't football. Typically on my end, just to think about, well, let me go back a little bit. Let's just talk about concussion a little bit. Obviously it's an impact type injury, and what happens is the brain actually compacts against the skull and the head, so you do get some form of trauma in there.
Is there a bruising on the brain then?
Sometimes in an extreme case, yes. Generally what I see, and I should knock on wood if I could, but you see the result of a concussion. I'll give an example. As I may have a kid that comes off, and one of the coaches will say, so-and-so's not seeming himself, or maybe he forgot to play. And in that instance, I'll come over and they'll come and say, I got really dinged. It's a big terminology, is dinged, or my bell rung. And at that point, what I do is, I automatically want to assess, okay, what happened? And once I kind of get an idea of what happened, immediately what we do is I was very conservative, and that's kind of what the athletic trainers and, the high school league, we got to look at the safety side first.
Exactly.
So my immediate response is the kids are going to be out for 15 minutes. We're going to assess, if they have a certain symptoms, whether they're dizzy, maybe a headache, maybe some ringing in the ears, any loss of memory, anything like that. They're going to be sitting and with me. Usually I take their helmet and we're going to be monitoring during that 15-minute time frame.
How important is it to catch it early? I mean, it sounds like you sit them down for 15 minutes right away as soon as you find out, right? Is that pretty important? Or?
The quicker you can catch it or assess it if it happens at an event, the better off it is, because generally what you can do is you can observe that athlete, check the symptoms, you can speak with a parent or a coach, give the kids the signs and symptoms to look for, because typically what most people don't understand is a concussion, once it happens, you may get some of them symptoms, you may not. Those symptoms also may progress as the evening goes on, and you could have some issues later on. So I think it's really key. And on my end, I usually will see these kids. If I have pulled them for a concussion or symptoms related to that concussion, they need to be seen by their physician. Okay. We recommend that they go in, have a consultation with their physician, and typically they're not allowed to return back to the sport for at least 1 week's time, or until they're symptom-free.
Okay.
And that's symptom-free with any type of activity, whether it's, when you get to the more extreme cases, I guess I'll elaborate a little bit. There's 3 grades of concussion. There's grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3.
Okay.
Depending on what studies you're reading and who you go through, those can change a little bit. But typically, if there's any loss of consciousness, you have to suspect a concussion or maybe a cervical injury. Those kids are typically done with the event that day. Which kind of leads into another aspect would be, I'm sure you've heard of second impact syndrome, which means if someone sustained a concussion and maybe got back to the sport a little too early, and boom, they've sustained another concussion within a small time frame. The symptoms and the long distance effects with that have been proven to show some pretty severe detrimental damage to the individual.
Right. So you're there to assess on the scene, and then you make a recommendation for them to see their physician, and then you look for a clearance by the physician before they return to the sport.
Absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense to protect the safety of the player, obviously.
And the nice thing about that, too, and I guess with my profession and working with the coaches and the relationship I have here in Austin is wonderful for the fact that I think in my position I can step in and act as that mediator. I mean, the coach doesn't have to take that responsibility of making the decision, is the kid okay or is he not? I can step in and make that decision for him. He can continue to coach his game, or she can continue to coach the game. The athlete's getting taken care of. Bottom line is we want to make sure the athletes are safe and healthy.
Right.
And that's kind of why we're there.
Well, I really appreciate that, because I remember being a high school athlete, and it's pretty difficult as a high school athlete to say, Coach, I'm really hurting. You got to take me out of the game. I mean, it's just like it's really hard to say that because you just want to play so bad, and you don't want to come across like a wimp or whatever, you know. So to have someone like you there can be very helpful. I can see that. I
think it kind of tie in with that. I mean, the no pain, no gain theory of years ago is kind of not. I mean, there's certain aspects where that's okay, but generally when it comes to an injury, you know, you know, I always hear a lot of coaches say, are you hurt or are you injured? And there's a definite relationship there. You know, some kids are hurt maybe just to get out of practice.
Right.
Or some are definitely injured. And to have that person there to act as the go-between between the coaches, maybe the doctors, or with the parents is really helpful. And that's the one avenue that I found, especially with the concussions, and that is one of my main things I do is I have a paperwork that I send home with the kid. The parents come talk to me that evening. I give them the information that they need to look for, my number. So we've got contacts taken. The coaches are all in on this. So it's a wonderful aspect to you know, like you said, maybe catch these a little earlier and make sure that you know, because if one goes untreated, you know, the effects are worse.
Right.
You know, so we don't want to see that happen.
Right. I'm thinking of cross country right now. I would guess a common injury would be ankle injuries.
Pretty common, yeah.
What do we do to prevent ankle injuries?
Well, talking about cross country, I mean, we'll kind of step away from the contact issues. I mean, still have the potential for concussion. However, you're going to see more of a chronic overuse type injuries in the cross country.
Okay.
I see a lot of ankles. I see a lot of, you know, and I will say, and I'm not picking on people that run long distance, but typically they don't like to stretch a lot. And kind of leads to having a little bit of inflexibility. And then we do get the ankle injuries, or maybe the hamstring injuries, or the upper thigh muscle injuries. And it's basically a lot of what I found with the ankle injuries, and that is, you know, education, maybe talking to the coaches, the kids, pre-season, during the season about, you know, flexibility, making sure that they're taking care of their bodies. So when you are injured, maybe you rest, you don't do as many miles that week, or you modify, get on a rehabilitation program, which is something that I do. I work with the kids that are injured to get them back to the sport by, you know, strengthening the limb that's injured, or doing the rehab to get the inflammation out of there.
Right.
So I see that quite a bit with the ankles.
Right. I fell when I was running a few years ago, Kris, and sprained my ankle really bad, I thought. And my thought went back to my high school coach, who said, if it hurts, walk on it and walk it out.
Sure.
You know. I mean, is that old school by now? I mean, I don't think that was a very good idea. In fact, in my case, I found out I had a broken ankle, not a sprained one, and I was trying to walk on it because that was the voice I was hearing in my head.
Absolutely.
So what's the latest on that one? What should we know about that?
I would have to say, fortunately for me, any program that I've been involved with, I used to work in the Twin Cities and then now down here in Austin, and I've been fortunate enough not to have the coaches that force that.
Okay.
They're really into, you know, if the child's hurt, you know, this is only a game. Yeah. We're not going to force them out there. Yeah. But unfortunately, there are still some of that thought processes out there that people think, well, you're fine, and then, you know, the poor kid doesn't want to let the coach down.
Yeah.
You know, and there's also some other outside pressures that, you know, kids don't want to say they're hurt because maybe they lose their spot, or people are going to think they're a wimp. We don't want that to happen. But I would say for the most part, and fortunately for me, I haven't had to deal with that, but it is still prevalent out there, I think.
Okay. But you recommend not pushing it when people are hurting.
Absolutely.
It's not about walking it out or whatever. It's about resting it, giving it attention, taking care of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
I have the big thing, and if any of the kids that I work with are here, they would probably laugh, but typically when I tell them that if you've sustained an injury, and I'll use an ankle as an example, if you've sustained an injury on your ankle that you can't walk like a normal person, it's probably significant enough that you shouldn't be participating.
Okay.
And then they know the adage of, they always probably hear this from me is ice, ice, ice.
Okay.
And there's the acronym RICE that I use. I like to say PRICE. It's protect, rest, ice, compression, and elevation.
Oh, wow.
Or just RICE, you know, rest, ice, compression, and elevation, to get that body part to not be so inflamed.
Great. Could you say that again a little slower for our viewers, because that was a really good acronym
The acronym I use, it's PRICE.
Okay.
So when you have an injured, using the ankle or injured body part, the PRICE is protection.
Okay.
So maybe you put an ACE wrap on it, or you pad it. are rest it. Obviously,
Okay.
your body's telling you to rest it.
Yep.
Ice, get
Ice
that
for ice.
swelling down.
Mm-hmm.
Compression, whether it's an ACE wrap or something to kind of compress the injury to keep that swelling under control, or even to just during the day to remind you that you've got something going on. And then elevation. And typically, elevation always means you need to elevate the extremity above your heart level.
Yep.
So it's getting that swelling to work its way out of there. And that's
Great.
usually that initial phase of an injury at sacrament. I press it out there all the time.
Oh, I love that. I love that. It's simple, easy to remember,
Right.
has all the helpful hints, right?
Absolutely.
Right built into it.
Absolutely.
Now, this time of year, we deal with a lot of potential for heat exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about that a little bit.
Fortunately, we've lucked out. We haven't had a lot of the heat
It's been-
like we've
yeah.
had.
Mhm.
But there's, as you probably read in the news or listened in that there's a few people that have dealt with that. Heat exhaustion for us, I guess maybe what I should just explain the differences. There's heat exhaustion, there's heat stroke, and then there's heat cramps.
Okay.
I'm going to start with probably the lesser of the three. However, they all work together.
Yeah, because I know there's been some deaths, even student deaths as well as professional deaths from some of
Yes,
this. So I'm
unfortunately.
looking forward to your explanation.
So
there.
I'll start with the heat cramps. Typically, heat cramps, if someone has experienced a heat cramp, and you may have had these if you ran where you get the cramps in the calves and that. And usually what that's due to is maybe an imbalance in your hydration levels, which can cause the muscles to cramp up. And it's first sign of dehydration. And maybe your body's not sweating properly. Usually pretty easy to work through. Changing diet, working through fluids, you can work through that pretty well. Next phase would be kind of like your heat exhaustions, whether it's heat related. Typically, your body is not able to cool itself properly.
Mm-hmm.
You've maybe are dehydrated. You're going to have some of the symptoms of the dizziness, maybe some nausea and that. Your body temperature is going to be, in that 100 to 102 range. Definitely need to be removed from the field. Body needs to be cooled. And when I say removed from the field, maybe to an area where there's shade, maybe where there's, in Minnesota with the humidity, obviously you'd look for air conditioning. And you want to cool the body as fast as you can. Not crazy, but you want to get them out of the heat. Because all of these can go to the next extreme. The worst would be the heat stroke, which some of the pro athletes I think Corey Stringer was a very well-known gentleman that happened through that. And that's basically when the body's over 104 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And the body needs to be cooled as soon as possible. That means the best way to do that is, water submersion, ice baths, to get that temperature down. And then monitoring, because basically what's happening is the central nervous system is shutting down unless it gets cooled properly.
Right.
So it's pretty extreme.
So are you actually taking the temperature of athletes, or how do you know when it's time to put them in the shade or when it's time to put them in an ice bath?
I guess personally on my level is I educate as much as I can in the off seasons, pre-seasons. As before I came here today, I was doing a talk with Austin's girls soccer team about hydration and that. And I guess I'm always watching that as far as any little signs and symptoms. I'm having pulling these kids aside and talking to them, pulling them to the shade. Fortunately for me, I haven't had any issues. I've had some kids with the heat cramping, and they've been pulled from competition, kind of cooled down, and we've discussed hydration and techniques like that. So fortunately, I haven't been to that level. There are ways. There's pills that can be taken. Now at the pro level, where money isn't an issue. And then you can walk around with a little wand and check the body temperature of people.
Right. Oh, okay.
I don't have
I
that
see.
luxury. Could use a digital thermometer, but it's a lot of the symptoms. And I do carry a thermometer in my medical kit that we could check, temperatures if we needed to.
Great. I understand someone called in and was asking about weightlifting and what age do kids start that? Is 12 too early? What do you suggest for weightlifting? When should kids start with that?
That's a great question, and I hear that a lot. And I think more kids now that are being more competitive tend to maybe push into that a little bit quicker. My personal philosophy is the kids are pretty young and they're still developing. Those growth plates aren't all the way fixed. So I personally wouldn't push weight training at that age until maybe they get into the 14, 15-year-old range.
Okay.
The body's a little more susceptible. The tendons are going to respond a little better. I have a lot of kids that I work with also that maybe the junior high level in 6th grade that they want to get stronger. So, I mean, using your own body weight, whether it's push-ups, pull-ups, the sit-ups instead of the weights, is just as effective as the weight training. But personally, I would say wait a little bit more, maybe till you're that freshman in high school. Some kids are different. Maybe they develop a little quicker than others, and they'd probably be okay. But the 12, I think, is really pretty young to be adding weight to a resistance-type training regimen.
Right, sure. I'm curious about nutrition, kind of an important aspect of this, I would think. So give us your brief speech on that. What do you recommend for athletes in terms of how they eat?
First of all, I would say eat. What I think nowadays, there's two spectrums. There's the people that eat too much, and we have the obese society, and then there's the kids that are so worried about looking thin. What I always tell, and it ties right into that talk I just did, and I put up on the screen that a competitive soccer game, typically in 1 hour, a person who weighs 130 pounds burns about 590 calories. That's 1 hour. Typical soccer games are about 2 hours. So roughly you're running around 1,000 calories. My next question to one of the athletes is, I said, how many calories do you eat in a day? And they said, probably about 1,500. Well, right there's a problem.
Right.
Okay, and these kids were having issues with, not being able to make it through the game, being tired, stuff like that. So my speech to them is it's important that you understand the proteins, the carbohydrates, and that doesn't mean McDonald's, anything like that, or any of the fast food joints that people would go to. That means hitting all the balanced diets, eating the calories you need to sustain what you're doing.
Sure. So like, let's say I'm a football player or a cross-country runner. I eat a decent breakfast at home, maybe some eggs, oatmeal, whatever, a little fruit. At lunchtime, what should I be sure to be getting in? If I'm going to be running or playing a game in the evening, what should I be eating at lunch? What should I be eating before the game?
Okay, very good questions. The main thing, and this is something that I read somewhere, and I always tell the kids, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and your supper should be more like a pauper. Okay. But basically what you're doing is you're loading up your fuels early in the morning and setting the standard. So typically what I'm looking with the kids that are maybe the more endurance runners, you're going to probably push more of your carbohydrates with those kids. A great way to figure that out, and there's several websites out there, the NATA.org is a very good one.
NATA.org.
NATA.org, which is the National Athletic Trainers Association. What I use, I think it's the American Dietetic Association, but there's depending on the activity level you're doing, a person should have so many grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. And the same with proteins, depending on what your activity levels are.
And they can get that information off the site.
Yep, absolutely. Those can be found on the site. And typically what you want to do, if you're an active person, you're in a sport, you want to make sure you're eating a balanced diet, making sure you're getting the carbohydrates, making sure you're getting your proteins. And those should all be, if you know you've got a game, obviously it's important that you eat all throughout the day, not minutes before you play.
Right.
Because we all know what the effects of that could do.
And what about these, these special drinks? There's Propel and there's other drinks like that. I mean, Gatorade. Are these good things? Should they be drinking them in the afternoon during the games? Tell us about that. I'll
give you the rule of thumb that I teach the athletes that I work with. They always get the question from the parents: water or sports drinks? What do I do? One of the guidelines that I use is if you're in an activity that's maybe 75 minutes or less, water is going to be just fine for you. Okay? It's going to hydrate you properly. If we're doing something that's maybe a little over that 75-minute mark, you probably want to think about mixing a sport drink in there.
All right.
Now, what the idea behind the sports drink is, it's typically Gatorade. They have the sodium and a little bit of the carbohydrate in there, which is going to replenish what you've sweated out. Okay. Usually, and this is water too, you want to drink maybe a bottle of Gatorade, 2 to 3 hours before your game. And then you want to hydrate about 6 to maybe 12 ounces 15 to 20 minutes before you go out onto the field. And then during competition, you should be hydrating at least probably 8 to 10 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes. Okay.
So I'm hearing the hydrating is pretty important.
Hydrating is important.
And before, during, and after, I presume?
Absolutely. And actually after 30 minutes prior post-activity is the ultimate time to replenish those fluids, and that's usually when I recommend the kids have their, whether it's a Propel or a Gatorade or whatever. I always say whatever tastes good to you, as long as it falls into the category of 6 to 8% carbohydrate, that's what you drink, because then the kids will drink it.
Okay, great.
So,
I understand we've only got a minute or two left
Okay.
here, Kris. But where do you see the future of athletic training heading? Are there changes on the horizon? What do you think's coming up?
well, hopefully down the road, and this is off what we're talking about, that we'll be able to do some more outreach to the schools. I read an amazing stat before I came in here. There's 30,000 athletic trainers currently nationally, and only 42% of the high schools have certified athletic trainers working.
Okay.
And to add on to that, currently there's 7 million high school athletes nationwide, and almost 715,000 injuries annually amongst those athletes.
Wow.
But
so
you
we
can see
really
there's a
need
pretty
those certified athletic trainers.
And that definitely a lot of the, I think people at the secondary education level are really seeing that need, and hopefully it makes a turn. I would say it's going in the right direction. I just think it's a matter of keeping educating people and letting them know what we are able to do and how we can help.
Sure. And it sounds like this might be a field, if there are young people out there looking for, hey, what am I doing with my future? There may be a definite need
Absolutely.
For certified athletic trainers in the future.
Yep. I always tell the kids at the school, if you have an interest in sports, but you can't play sports your whole life, it's a great opportunity, and it's a fun lifestyle. I really enjoy it, and it's fun. And I encourage the kids at the high school, or maybe if there's any callers out there that are high school age, to contact me at the high school, and I can certainly send you down a path as to getting more information as becoming a certified athletic trainer.
Wow,
So.
super. Thanks, Kris, so much
bet.
for being with us this evening. And thank you for joining us tonight on Health Connections. For more information, or to watch this episode again, or to catch a previous episode, visit ksmq.org and click on Health Connections. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode of Health Connections. Thank you again, Kris. I'm David Larson for KSMQ. Good night.